The anniversary card sat in the trash, unopened. Right on top of yesterday's takeout container, still stained with soy sauce. I stared at it for a second, then reached down, picking it up between two fingers. Expensive cardstock, thick, embossed lettering. I had taken my time choosing it, something simple but meaningful. No flowery nonsense, just a reminder of the years we'd built together. And she hadn't even bothered to open it. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger was a waste of energy. What I felt was something colder, sharper. A sense of clarity creeping in like a tide. My name is Marcus Jenkins. I'm 62 years old, a retired Marine officer, and I've spent most of my life brokering peace between people who would rather see each other dead. I know how to read a room. I can tell when a man is lying before he even opens his mouth. I can sense when an agreement is about to fall apart. It's a skill that has served me well in international relations, in back-channel negotiations, in boardrooms filled with men in expensive suits trying to outmaneuver each other. And now apparently I had to use it in my own damn home. Bella had been acting different for months. At first, it was small things, excuses that didn't quite add up, an edge of impatience in her voice when we spoke. The gym trips that stretched longer, the phone that was always face down. A shift in the way she carried herself, like she was walking towards something instead of beside me. I had ignored it. Or maybe I had just given her the benefit of the doubt. A mistake, it seemed. I dropped the card back in the trash, where she'd left it, and walked out the door. The gym smelled like sweat and rubber, the sound of weights clanking against metal racks filling the air. It was a good place to clear my head, a space where men came to work, not talk. Frank "Tank" Scott was waiting near the squat rack, chalking up his hands. He was built like a bulldozer, all thick muscle and tan skin, a former powerlifter who had found religion in deadlifts and discipline. He gave me a nod as I walked up. "You're late," he said, tossing me a towel. "Didn't know we were running a boot camp," I muttered, wiping my hands. Frank grinned. "Somebody's gotta keep you accountable, old man." I smirked, stepping onto the platform. "Careful who you're calling old." We worked through the sets in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that only comes with years of friendship. It wasn't until we hit the bench press that Frank spoke again. "You good?" I exhaled, staring up at the ceiling. "Why?" Frank shrugged. "You look like you're thinking too much. Usually, you come in here to get out of your own head." I pressed the bar up, racking the weight. "You ever get the feeling something's off, but you can't put your finger on it?" Frank leaned against the rack, watching me. "Yeah. Back when my ex was sneaking around. Thought she was just stressed, working late. Turns out she was working on something else." I sat up, rolling my shoulders. "How'd you know?" "She got sloppy. Started acting guilty instead of just distant. You get that feeling, man, you already know." I didn't say anything. Just reached for the water bottle, taking a long sip. "Look," Frank said, crossing his arms. "I ain't saying jump to conclusions, but if you think something's going on, don't sit on it. Find out." And when you do, he paused, then shook his head. "Just don't be stupid about it." I nodded, getting up. My muscles felt tight, my thoughts tighter. I wasn't going to be stupid about it. I was going to be smart. The taxi dispatch office was a small, cluttered building on the east side of town, the kind of place that smelled like old coffee and burnt rubber. I had met Marty Fisher a few years back when I needed a reliable ride to the airport, and over time we'd struck up a casual friendship. He was a blunt, heavy-set man with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, always speaking into a headset, always watching screens. He glanced up when I walked in. "Well, look who it is. What, you need a ride? Thought you were too fancy for taxis these days." "Still humble," I said, leaning on the counter. "Just got a question." Marty adjusted his headset. "Shoot. Bella's been taking a lot of cabs lately." I kept my voice casual. "You got any idea where she's been going?" Marty gave me a look. "You want me to check logs on your wife?" I met his gaze. Didn't say anything. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "Man, I don't get into domestic stuff. Not asking for details. Just general locations." Marty hesitated, then sighed. "She's been going downtown. Couple times a week. High-rise on Bay Street." He tapped a few keys. "Same drop-off, different times. Bay Street. Corporate offices." I knew exactly who worked there. Samuel Harris. I kept my expression neutral. "Appreciate it." Marty frowned. "You sure you want to go down this road?" I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Already on it." I turned and walked out, my footsteps steady, my mind sharper than it had been in months. The lights of Winston Bay reflected in the glass of the high-rise office building. It was late, most floors dark, but the top floors were still lit. I didn't go in. Didn't need to. I just stood there, watching. Waiting. It didn't take long. A taxi pulled up. The door opened. Bella stepped out. She smoothed down her dress, glanced around, then walked inside. And just like that, any doubt I had left was gone. I wasn't a man who acted on impulse. I had spent my life negotiating, listening, reading between the lines. And I had just read all I needed to. She had made her choice. Now it was my turn. I didn't go home right away. I drove for a while, letting the engine hum beneath my hands, letting my thoughts settle like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The city lights blurred past, but I wasn't really looking at them. My mind was turning over the facts, the evidence, the cold, hard reality of it all. Bella had been lying to me. For months. And not just little lies, the kind people tell to smooth things over or avoid small conflicts. No, these were the kind of lies that took planning. The kind that required coordination, secrecy, effort. She had been choosing him again and again over me. And that wasn't something I could just talk my way through. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house was dark. Her car was parked in its usual spot. I sat there for a second, hands on the wheel, watching the windows. Then I got out, moving slow, controlled. Inside, the place was quiet. Too quiet. Bella was in the kitchen, standing by the fridge, a glass of wine in her hand. She was wearing one of those fitted tops she liked, the kind that showed off just enough to remind people she still had it. She looked up when I walked in, and for the briefest second there was something in her expression, something flickering, uncertain. But then it was gone, replaced by a tired smile. "You're home late," she said, taking a sip of her wine. "So are you," I replied, setting my keys on the counter. She tilted her head, studying me like she was trying to gauge my mood. "Long day?" I nodded, stepping toward the fridge. "Something like that." She let out a sigh, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, same here. Work's been crazy." I opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of water. Took my time twisting the cap off. "That right?" She nodded. "Meetings, back to back. I barely had time to eat." I took a slow sip, let the silence stretch. I wanted to see if she'd fill it. Sure enough, she did. And after work, I just needed to clear my head, so I stopped by the gym. The gym. The one Frank said she hadn't been to in weeks. I turned, meeting her gaze. "That's so?" She smiled, taking another sip. "Yeah. You know how it is. Stress relief." I let the silence settle again. She shifted, tapping her fingers against the counter. "What about you? What did you do?" I smiled. "Went for a drive. Thought about a few things." She nodded, waiting, but I didn't give her anything else. Just let the air between us thicken. Finally, she set her glass down, pushing off the counter. "I'm beat. Gonna shower and head to bed." I watched her walk away, my jaw tight. She was good. I'd give her that. Lying like it was nothing, looking me straight in the eye, weaving a story as if it was the truth. But I was better. I waited until I heard the water running, then walked into my office, shutting the door behind me. I pulled out my laptop, clicked open my financial accounts. Joint savings, investment portfolios, the house deed, everything we had built together over the years. And I started making changes. The next morning, I was up early, moving through my routine like nothing had changed. The coffee was hot, the newspaper crisp, the world outside just as predictable as ever. Bella walked into the kitchen, towel drying her hair, her phone in hand. She looked relaxed, casual. I waited until she sat down, then slid a manila folder across the table. She blinked, setting her coffee down. "What's this?" "Statement of accounts." I took a sip of my coffee. "Thought you should see where we stand financially." She frowned, flipping it open. Her eyes skimmed the pages, then stopped. Her posture stiffened. "What the hell is this?" "Reallocations." I set my mug down. "I moved some things around." She looked up, as sharp now. "You transferred our savings." I nodded. "Legally, it was never ours. Just mine." She set the papers down, forcing a laugh. "What are you doing?" I met her gaze. "Making sure I'm protected." Her expression shifted, confusion, then something closer to anger. "Mark, what is this about?" I leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I think you know." She stared at me, her jaw tightening. I let the moment stretch, watching her, letting her feel the weight of it. Then I stood, picking up my coffee. "Just a heads up, Nat, things are about to change." And with that, I walked out the door. I sat across from Bella at Tide and Timber, one of the nicest restaurants in Winston Bay. It was the kind of place where the waiters wore pressed white shirts and the wine list was longer than the dinner menu. We used to come here for anniversaries, for celebrations. Tonight, there was nothing to celebrate. She didn't know that yet. She adjusted the cloth napkin in her lap, her eyes flicking over the menu like she actually cared what she was about to order. She was good at this, playing the part, acting normal. She still thought she was in control. The waiter approached and she smiled up at him, ordering a glass of red. I just asked for water. As soon as the waiter left, she looked at me, tilting her head slightly. You've been acting weird. I smiled. How so? She sighed, swirling the water in her glass. You're different. Quieter. And moving money around? What was that about? I leaned back in my chair. Just making sure things are in order. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't stupid. She knew me well enough to sense when I was holding something back. Mark, if something's wrong, just say it. The waiter returned, setting her wine glass down. She barely acknowledged him. I watched her take a sip, setting the glass down carefully. Then I reached into my jacket and placed my phone on the table between us. One tap and the screen lit up. A picture of her stepping out of a cab. Then another, her walking into Samuel Harris's building. Another and another. Different nights, same story. She stared at the screen. I saw her throat tighten as she swallowed. I folded my hands together. You were saying? Her fingers twitched near the stem of her glass like she was debating whether to grab it or shove it off the table. Her jaw tensed, then she forced out a breath, shaking her head slightly. Jesus, Mark? That's all you've got? I kept my voice even, measured. Nothing else? She pressed her lips together, still staring at the screen. Then she straightened, shifting back in her chair, her expression hardening. How long have you known? I picked up my glass of water and took a sip, letting her sit in it for a moment. Long enough. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. All right. She reached for her wine, took a steady sip. So, what now? That was what struck me, the sheer lack of remorse. No excuses. No apologies. Just a woman trying to figure out how bad the damage was. I tilted my head. That's what you want to ask? She gave a small, humorless laugh, shaking her head again. I mean, what do you want me to say, Mark? You already know. You wouldn't have brought me here if you didn't. So yeah, what now? I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift. Any trace of warmth of the life we had built was just gone. She wasn't my wife anymore. Hadn't been for a long time. You get nothing, I said, calm, absolute. She blinked. What? I leaned in slightly. The prenup. You forgot about it, didn't you? I watched her carefully, saw the flicker in her expression, the realization, the first sign of panic. Her jaw clenched. You wouldn't. I already did. I gestured toward my phone. Your little adventure cost you everything. The house? Mine. The savings? Already moved. The accounts? Locked. You walk away from this with what you came in with. I let that sit for a second before adding, which, if I recall, wasn't much. Her nostrils flared slightly. She sat back, gripping the edge of the table. Mark, you don't have to do this. No, Bella, I said, my voice like steel. You didn't have to do this. Her lips pressed together so tightly they went pale. She stared at me, but I could see the calculations running in her head, the angles she was trying to find. She had nothing. No leverage. No move left to make. I picked up my phone, slid it back into my pocket, and finished my water. I think we're done here. She exhaled, slow, measured, like she was still trying to keep some dignity intact. Then she grabbed her wine glass, downed what was left in one go, and set it down harder than she needed to. She didn't say another word. I stood, placed a couple of bills on the table, and walked out. She didn't follow. I drove home with the kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. No more guessing, no more doubts. The weight of it all had lifted, leaving only a cold sense of purpose. Bella would try to fight, that much was certain. She'd look for an angle, a way to claw something back. But there wasn't one. I had made sure that before I ever sat across from her at that table. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. She hadn't beaten me home. That didn't surprise me. She'd need time to process, maybe even reach out to Samuel. See if he had any bright ideas. I went inside, tossed my keys on the counter, and grabbed a beer from the fridge. The bottle was cold in my hand, condensation running down the glass as I twisted the cap off. I didn't even bother turning on the lights. Just stood there in the dark kitchen, letting the silence settle around me. A part of me had expected to feel something more, anger, sadness, regret. But all I felt was certainty. This wasn't a loss. It was a correction. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glanced at the screen. A text from Frank. Frank, how'd it go? I smirked, taking a sip of my beer before tapping out a response. Me, as expected. A few seconds later, another buzz. Frank, she'd take it well? Me, like a woman who just realized she bet on the wrong horse. I set my phone down and exhaled. Tomorrow, the real fallout would begin. The next morning, I was already on my second cup of coffee when Bella finally came downstairs. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she was wearing the same robe she used to lounge around in when things were still good between us. I didn't say anything. Just watched as she poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. She didn't look at me, not at first. Finally, she spoke. So that's it? I set my mug down, tilting my head slightly. You were expecting something else? She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I don't know. A conversation, maybe? I leaned back in my chair. We had one. She looked up then, meeting my eyes. You're really just going to cut me off like that? Like I meant nothing? I let the silence stretch, let the words sit between us. Then I nodded. Yeah. Her jaw clenched, and for a second I thought she might throw the coffee cup. Instead, she took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. You don't even want to know why? No, I said simply. That caught her off guard. She blinked, then narrowed her eyes. You don't care. I shrugged. I care about actions. The reasons? They don't change the outcome. She stared at me, her fingers tightening around the mug. You're colder than I thought. I stood, picking up my mug and rinsing it out in the sink. No, Nat. I'm just done. She didn't respond, and I didn't wait for one. At the office, Samuel Harris was having a bad morning. I knew that because I had made sure of it. I sat across from an old friend, a man with a sharp suit and a sharper mind, one who had spent years in government before moving into private intelligence. He had no official title, no business card, but he knew exactly how things worked in the corporate world. He slid a folder across the table. Your guy's dirty. I flipped it open, scanning the documents. Samuel's financials, work history, the quiet little deals he thought nobody was paying attention to. Fraud? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Nothing blatant. Just enough to call into question his ethics. If someone were to, say, leak this to the right people, he'd be untouchable in this industry. I nodded. And if we push a little harder? He smiled. He loses everything. I closed the folder, sliding it back. Do it. By noon, the wheels were already in motion. Samuel's boss had called him in for a discussion. An anonymous tip had landed on the desk of the company's compliance officer. By the time the workday ended, his name would be mud. I sat in my office, watching the phone, waiting. Sure enough, not long after, it rang. Bella. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. This time from an unknown number. I picked up. Jenkins. A pause. Then a voice I recognized. Samuel. We need to talk, he said. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath. No, we don't. You think this is over? I smirked. I know it is. Another pause, then a low chuckle. You think you're a hard man, don't you? I didn't answer. Didn't need to. He exhaled sharply. Fine. You made your point. But let's not make this worse than it needs to be. I leaned back in my chair. Worse for who? Silence. I let it stretch before speaking again. You had your fun, Samuel. You thought you were the smartest guy in the room. But you forgot something important. Oh yeah? And what's that? I smiled. I don't lose. I hung up. The fallout had begun. By the end of the week, the damage was done. Samuel was out of a job. Not fired exactly, companies like his didn't like making a scene, but asked to resign was just a polite way of being shoved out the door. The whispers had started too. It was amazing how fast reputations unraveled once the right people started asking the right questions. Bella had gone quiet. She wasn't calling anymore, wasn't leaving texts I ignored. I figured she was still in damage control, trying to figure out if there was a way out of this mess that didn't leave her with nothing. There wasn't. Frank and I were at the gym when I finally got confirmation of it. I had just finished a set when he nodded toward the news playing on the screen above the treadmills. Looks like your buddy's making headlines. I glanced up. The news anchor was running a segment on corporate ethics, one of those soft-hit stories that wasn't quite a scandal but just enough to make investors nervous. Samuel's company was mentioned by name. The words internal review flashed across the screen. I smirked, wiping sweat from my forehead. That was fast. Frank chuckled. Guess he'll have more free time now. I set the towel down, rolling out my shoulders. Not my problem. Frank studied me for a second. So what now? I knew what he was asking. The revenge part was over. The house was mine, the accounts secured, and the problem had been handled. But that wasn't the same as moving on. I sighed, glancing around the gym, the familiar clang of weights, the steady rhythm of people working, pushing forward. Now I get back to normal. Frank raised an eyebrow. You sure? I gave a small smirk. Not really. Normal, as it turned out, took some adjusting. The first weekend after everything settled, I found myself standing in the kitchen, staring at an empty calendar. No plans. No dinners to schedule around. No consideration for what Bella might want. Just time. I poured myself a drink and walked out onto the back patio. The ocean was quiet tonight, the waves rolling and steady and slow. It had been a long time since I'd really listened to them. The phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, saw the name on the screen. Bella. I exhaled, debating whether to answer. Finally, I tapped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. She didn't say anything at first. Just silence, a breath on the other end of the line. Then finally, so that's it. I leaned back in my chair, watching the tide come in. Yeah. She let out a slow breath. You're really not going to forgive me. I took a sip of my drink. Not my job to. Another pause. I never meant to hurt you. I let out a small, humorless chuckle. You just didn't care if you did. She didn't argue. That was something at least. I don't know what to do now, she admitted, voice quieter. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again. Not my problem. I heard the way her breath hitched, like she wanted to say something else. But she didn't. The line went dead. I set the phone down, staring at it for a moment, then turned back to the ocean. Normal. Yeah. I'd get there. The next few weeks were quiet. Not the uneasy kind of quiet, the kind that makes you brace for another hit. This was different. Settled. I woke up, made my coffee, read the paper, went to the gym. There were no more lingering glances across the kitchen, no more excuses about late meetings or gym sessions that never happened. Bella was gone. Officially. The divorce was finalized, the paperwork signed, and she had moved out. She hadn't fought for the house, not that she could. I had made sure of that. She took what was hers and left. Where she went after that I didn't ask. Didn't care. Frank and I were sitting outside the gym one evening, finishing up the usual post-workout routine, sweat, exhaustion, and a couple of protein shakes that tasted like cardboard. He leaned back against the bench, stretching his arms behind his head. So, what's next? He asked. I raised an eyebrow. You looking for some grand revelation? He smirked. I'm looking for an answer that's not business as usual. I exhaled, watching a group of younger guys load weights onto the bar. They moved with the same eagerness I had once had, the kind that made you think you could outwork anything. Life had a way of proving otherwise. I don't know, I admitted. Haven't really thought about it. Frank scoffed. Bullshit. You've had nothing but time to think about it. I smirked, taking a sip of my shake. He wasn't wrong. He nodded toward the street. You ever think about, I don't know, putting yourself out there again? I gave him a look. Are you asking if I'm dating? I'm asking if you're planning on dying alone, old man. I let out a dry laugh. Jesus, Frank. He shrugged. Hey, I'm just saying. You did your damage, you cleaned house. Now what? I sighed, stretching out my legs. I'm not rushing into anything. He nodded, then smirked. You should try something different. Cooking class. Something civilized. I raised an eyebrow. Cooking? Yeah. I hear women dig it. I scoffed, shaking my head. And where did you hear that? He grinned. Somewhere between my third divorce and my midlife crisis. I chuckled, shaking my head. Maybe he had a point. I signed up for the class on a whim. Nothing fancy, just a local thing at a small bistro on Main Street. It was the kind of place with chalkboard menus and fresh bread that smelled too good to be ignored. The instructor, Ivy Clayton, was in her late 50s, sharp as a knife, and didn't tolerate bullshit. She reminded me of some of my drill sergeants. You hold a knife like that again, and I'm kicking you out, she said, pointing at some poor guy gripping a chef's knife like he was about to carve up a side of beef. I smirked, adjusting my own grip. She caught the movement and nodded in approval. See, this one's got it. I wasn't sure why, but that small nod felt like an accomplishment. After class, I lingered a bit, helping clean up. Ivy glanced over at me, drying her hands on a towel. You're not half bad at this, she said. I shrugged. Figured I should learn to cook for myself. She gave me a look, the kind that saw through the surface. That why you're here? I exhaled, then smirked. That, and a buddy of mine swears it'll help me meet women. She laughed. Well, he's not wrong. But you strike me as a guy who's not in a rush for that. I nodded. Not in a rush, no. She studied me for a second, then nodded toward the back. You ever try making fresh pasta? I shook my head. She smirked. Stick around. I'll show you. I did. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what had been lost. I was thinking about what came next. The house was quiet. Not empty, not hollow, just quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't weigh on you, didn't make you feel like something was missing. It was mine again. Not a reminder of what had been, not a museum of broken trust. Just a house. My house. I stood in the kitchen, rolling my sleeves up, the scent of fresh basil and garlic filling the air. The cutting board was covered in flour, a ball of dough resting under a clean dish towel. Fresh pasta. Who the hell would have thought? The front door opened, and Frank walked in without knocking, like he always did. He sniffed the air and raised an eyebrow. Jesus Christ, you actually learned something? I smirked, setting the knife down. Turns out I'm a quick study. He walked over to the counter, peering at the dough. Cooking classes, gym, the whole Zen routine. You getting soft on me? I chuckled. Not soft, just done fighting battles that aren't worth it. Frank nodded, leaning against the counter. So what's next? You gonna settle into the single life? Or you got your eye on someone? I shrugged. Not rushing anything. He smirked. You and the chef, huh? I rolled my eyes. Her name's Ivy, and it's not like that. Yet. I shook my head, grabbing a beer from the fridge and tossing him one. He cracked it open and took a long sip. Ran into Bella the other day, he said casually. I raised an eyebrow. Yeah. She looks like shit. I took a sip of my own beer. That so? Yeah. Guess things didn't work out with lover boy. He leaned on the counter, watching me. Not that it matters. Didn't. I had one. Not by screaming, not by begging, not by dragging it out in the dirt. I won by walking away with everything while she was left picking up the pieces of a life she torched. That was justice. Not revenge, not pettiness, just consequences. Frank studied me for a second, then nodded. You look better, though. I smirked. That so? Yeah. Like a guy who doesn't have a knife in his back anymore. I laughed, shaking my head. The oven beeped. I drained the last of my beer, set it down, and went back to the stove. I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about dinner, about tomorrow, about the future. And for the first time in a long time, the future actually looked pretty damn good.